Good afternoon, and welcome as we continue this 125th anniversary season for Aquinas College, and as we continue our discussion of the Catholic intellectual tradition here at the college, both past and future. This is the second of three presentations that focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition. It began last week with my offering, and we'll continue today with Sister Barbara Reid, and then on April 11th at 7 o'clock in the evening, that's a Wednesday evening, in this room, a free presentation by George Weigel, Catholic theologian from the Institute for Ethics and Policy in Washington, D.C. Today I'm delighted to have invited and to bring as a homecoming back to campus Sister Barbara Reid, who as an undergraduate majored in Spanish here at Aquinas and then received her master's degree in religious studies from the old AIRS program, the Aquinas Institute for Religious Studies. She then left us and went, after teaching a short stint, to Catholic University in Washington, D.C., where she got her PhD in Scripture Studies and is a very well-known New Testament scholar. In it, she's written several books, including Taking Up the Cross, New Testament Interpretations Through Latina and Feminist Eyes, using her Spanish background for that one. The Gospel According to Matthew, Las Parábolas in Spanish, and Choosing the Better Part, Women in the Gospel of Luke, another book called A Retreat with St. Luke. She's also a weekly columnist, or has been, for America magazine, and is currently the general editor for a massive undertaking, a 60-volume set of scripture commentaries on the Bible from a feminist point of view, which will be coming out in installments over the next number of years. But it sounds like a wonderful and a massive undertaking, and certainly well needed. In addition, I found this while combing the archives for history. 2005, she was here last. This is the program from her talk then, called The Passion of Women and the Passion of Christ. Today I asked her to focus on the Catholic intellectual tradition, the Dominican tradition in particular, and then to speculate, if she would, about the future of that, because that's where we are going to live. And I'd like to welcome now Sister Barbara Reid. Please come up.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you all. It's especially delightful to see the room half full of my own Dominican sisters who know very well all about the Dominican intellectual tradition and who will help to correct the mistakes that I make and who will help us engage in this conversation further. It is such a pleasure for me to be here today. My years as an undergraduate student here at Aquinas in the 1970s and then in the AIRS program in the summers of the early 80s were some of my happiest years. The Dominican sisters, the lay professors, and the priests who were my professors and mentors, many of whom are here this afternoon, some of whom are still on the faculty at Aquinas, They built on the formation that was laid by the Adrian Dominican sisters who taught me in grade school and high school, and they shaped me for life. I am thoroughly Dominican in my education. Those who have served, you may have heard the motto of those who have served in the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. You know what their motto is? Ruined for life. They say that the experience of serving the poor and living in Jesuit communities for a year or more as a volunteer is a life-changing experience that ruins them for life. Well, I would like to propose that we don't ruin people for life when we form them in Dominican intellectual tradition, but I wonder if we could say that they are set aflame for life. Set aflame with the love of God and love of God's people, especially those who are most vulnerable and needy. Set aflame with passion for study, for lifelong learning that shapes them for the rest of their life and impels them to share the fire of God's love with all whose lives are intertwined with theirs. This is so, I would propose, whether one is a vowed Dominican, a Dominican associate, or a student or professor in a Dominican college or university. I've been asked to speak with you today about facing the future of the Dominican intellectual tradition. What will this tradition, which began in the Middle Ages, look like in the next 100 years? What challenges will it face, and how will it continue to maintain ties with the past as it moves into the future? Well, before trying to look into the future, I would like to begin by reflecting on how the charism of study was envisioned by St. Dominic when he founded the order in 1216, and how key it was to the development of the Dominican way of life. I will speak about 7 distinctive characteristics of study in the Dominican tradition, and then I will reflect on 2 key ways in which I think this gift is needed in the church and in the world today as we move into the future. From the beginning, study was a critical component of Dominican life. Dominic sent his first followers to the universities in Paris and Bologna, the center of the intellectual and religious world. He knew that if his followers were to preach truth, they needed to be formed not in isolation in monasteries away from the rest of the world, but in the universities where they could encounter new ideas, learn to think critically, and let themselves be changed through encounter with diverse others. So from the very beginning, Dominican formation starts in university settings. I want to speak now of 7 distinctive characteristics of study in the Dominican tradition. First is that study is a charism. So it is a gift given by God, a gift that sets one on fire for the truth, and on fire with love of God and love of God's people. One of the symbols that you often see to represent this charism is a torch. Often St. Dominic is depicted with a dog at his feet, holding a torch in his mouth. Have you seen that symbol? Well, I know all the sisters have, but the rest of you, have you seen that symbol? Where it comes from is that there is a legend that St. Dominic's mother, while pregnant, dreamed that she would give birth to a dog who would hold a torch in its mouth and would set the world on fire. So then, first of all, study is a charism, a gift from God meant to set the preacher on fire and the world on fire. Second, the charism of study is intimately related to the charism of contemplation. For Dominicans, there is a very fine line between prayer and study. The one easily blends into the other. The object of Dominican study is primarily the scriptures. Dominic was known to have carried with him always the Gospel of Matthew and Paul's letters. But study in the Dominican tradition is not restricted to the scriptures. Every arena of inquiry is to be explored, since all of creation reveals the Creator. St. Albert the Great wrote, "The whole world is theology, that is, a word about God for us." And Thomas Aquinas warned that a mistake in our understanding of creation will necessarily cause a mistake in our understanding of God. Likewise, the Vatican II document, Gaudium et Spes, the document on the church in the modern world, emphasizes that we carefully study the signs of our times and reflect on them in the light of the gospel. So in Dominican tradition, there is an intellectual itinerancy, meaning that we are to seek truth wherever it may be found. While study and contemplation flow into one another in Dominican life, another important thing to know is that Dominic often lets study take priority over contemplation or communal prayer. He would dispense the brothers from prayer for the sake of study. It was even written into the rule, which was an innovation at the time, that superiors could dispense the brothers from anything that hindered study, preaching, or the good of souls. Dominic also advocated that communal recitation of the Psalms be done with dispatch so that the brothers could quickly resume their study. I remember how startled I was the first time I prayed the office with Benedictines, who paused deliberately and slowly, savoring every word, while we Dominicans moved along at a quicker pace with our prayer so we could get back to study. Fra Angelico captures the intimate link between study and contemplation in two conjoined icons, one of the Annunciation and the other of St. Dominic at the foot of the cross. Mary and Dominic each have an open book in their lap, presumably the scriptures. It is impossible to say, is Mary studying or praying when God's messenger appears? Is Dominic studying or praying as he enters into the passion of Jesus? One other story about the relationship between study and contemplation in Dominican tradition. Close to the end of his life, Thomas Aquinas had an experience in which he heard Christ ask him what he desired. "Only you, Lord, only you," was his response. Something happened after this, but Thomas never spoke of it or wrote it down. What we do know is that he abandoned his study routine and refused to dictate any longer to his socius Reginald of Piperno. When Reginald begged him to get back to work, Thomas replied, "Reginald, I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me." So our second point is that study and contemplation are intimately related in Dominican tradition. A third characteristic of Dominican study is that, as with any charism, it is not given to any individual or any group for their own enjoyment alone. One is set ablaze in order to share the light with others. I know that you know our Dominican motto is contemplata alias tradere, contemplate and share with others the fruits of your contemplation. The same must be said of study. The point of study is for the sake of sharing the fruits with others, most particularly in preaching, in all the forms that takes. It is important to note that when Dominicans share the fruits of our contemplation or our study, it is not handing on to others a finished product. Rather, it is sharing with others how to enter into a way of life, a life of study and contemplation. It is like the proverbial adage, if you want to feed a person for a day, give her a fish. If you want to feed her for a lifetime, teach her to fish. So studious Dominicans teach others how to study. Another important aspect of study for the sake of mission is that mission, particularly to those most needy, takes priority over possessing the tools of study. One famous incident in the life of Dominic illustrates this. As a student, he had gathered a collection of religious books inscribed on parchment. He greatly treasured these, but one day he sold the whole lot so that he could give the money to some poor people. "I could not bear to prize dead skins," he said, "when living skins were starving and in need." And so, in Dominican tradition, study is always for the sake of the mission. Fourth, study in the Dominican tradition is not a solitary endeavor done individually or in isolation. It is communal in nature, done together and for the sake of the whole church. Now, that is not to say that a Dominican or one formed in Dominican intellectual tradition does not go apart for the solitude and quiet necessary for study and for scholarly investigation. But in Dominican tradition, it also is the case that groups commit ourselves to study the same topic, read the same book, and then come together to share the fruits of our study. One episode in Dominican history that underscores the communal nature of both our study and our preaching happened in Santo Domingo in 1511. The friars had arrived there from Spain in September of 1510, and they came there in order to devote themselves to the pastoral care of other Spaniards and to evangelize the native peoples. But very soon, the friars became aware of the abusive treatment of the indigenous peoples, as these were forced to become servants of the Spaniards. The Dominican community, disturbed by the submission and oppression of the native peoples, devoted themselves to long hours of meetings to study the problem in depth, until they decided to make a public denouncement of the atrocities. The friars prepared the denouncement in the form of a sermon, and together the whole community deliberated long and hard, writing the text together. Each member of the community signed the text, and then they chose Antonio de Montesinos to preach the homily on the fourth Sunday of Advent in 1511. And all together, they also stood together when the authorities wanted to know who was responsible, and they all said, "We are," and so all would take the repercussions for it. So our study then is always a communal endeavor, and the fruits of it belong to the whole community. Fifth, study in the Dominican tradition is a lively engagement with the present with a view to the future. So study for us is not the memorization of old texts. Moreover, study of the past is not intended to keep us in the past, but has as its goal the ability to understand history so as to interpret the present and give us wisdom for the future. When Dominic sent his first followers to the universities, he did this because the universities were the center of the intellectual and religious world. It was in these new schools that new ideas and new books were pouring in through Spain and Venice, coming from the Greek and the Arabic East. They were fashioning an entirely new way of thinking after 1,000 years of Augustine and Plato. This was the new science, and Dominic wanted his followers right there on the cutting edge. One of the outstanding figures among the early Dominicans at the University of Paris and then later at the University of Cologne was Thomas Aquinas. He was set on fire with new ideas and loved to explain them to others. William of Tocco, the most extensive biographer of Aquinas, wrote the following: Friar Thomas appeared to have received from God remarkable knowledge, for he surpassed all the professors. In his courses, he stated new problems, discovered new methods, used new sequences of proofs. To hear him teach was to be in contact with a new doctrine supported by new argumentation. One could not doubt that God, by touching him with a new light and with a newness of inspiration, led him to teach, from the beginning of his professorship, openly and directly, in word and in writing, new views, end quote. Now, were you counting? Did you hear how many times the word new was used by William of Tocco as he was describing Thomas? Thomas's description has the new in there 12 times. So new ideas, new discoveries, new ways of understanding, while firmly rooted in the tradition. This is what sets Dominicans on fire. Now, in order to know what is the newness, what is the change that is called for today and into the future, it is crucial to also study the past. One example was our brother Yves Congar, a French Dominican theologian who lived from 1904 to 1995. From the time he finished his seminary studies, he dedicated himself to the study of history. He kept card files. That's how you kept your records back in those days, in card files, recording all the books and articles he read through the years. He published surveys of books from all over Europe on every aspect of the church. And it was because of his lifelong study of literature on the church that he was then called on to help craft many of the documents of Vatican II. During the final days of Vatican II, he attended the last sessions in St. Peter's, where the bishops voted on the documents. He listened to the documents being read aloud, and afterward he wrote in his diary, quote, "In short, this morning that which was read came very extensively from me. I left the basilica slowly and with difficulty. A number of the bishops congratulated me, saying that this was very much my work," end quote. Congar was humbled at the extensive use of the fruit of his study. It was his diligent study of every aspect of the church in the past that led to exciting ways of thinking about and of being church for the future. We don't always know immediately what the fruits of our study will be. Little did Antonio de Montesinos and the other Spanish friars know that their study of St. Thomas's Summa in Salamanca would give them the tools they would need to preach powerfully in defense of the rights of the indigenous peoples in the New World. It is also interesting to note that when the Spanish Dominicans first decided to go to the Americas, when they asked the master of the order about this new enterprise, he encouraged them to go, but he reminded them they should take their books with them. So, who would have thought you would bring precious, heavy, expensive books with you into the jungle of the Americas? So, to be ready to preach the gospel for a new future, those formed in the Dominican intellectual tradition today, I dare say, will not only take books with us wherever we go, but are also likely to take our computers, our Kindles, our iPads, and our smartphones. So that fifth characteristic of Dominican study that I've been talking about is a lively engagement with the present with a view to the future. A sixth characteristic of study in Dominican tradition is that study is transformative. It profoundly changes us and our world, bringing us ever closer to the fullness of the reign of God. Our brother Timothy Radcliffe, Master General of the Order from 1992 through 2001, describes study as, quote, "opening your mind and heart to different ways of being human, by learning to be attentive, learning to listen," end quote. This attentiveness and listening means not simply gathering facts, but growing in wisdom, able to question one's own way of seeing the world. This requires a certain humility. Jordan of Saxony, Dominic's first successor as leader of the order, said, quote, "Dominic understood all things through the humility of his heart," end quote. So Dominican study is not an affair of the head alone, but of head and heart together, along with one's whole being. The kind of transformation that follows when there is an opening of heart, mind, and self to new ways of understanding and being is a joyous and freeing experience. Timothy Radcliffe even goes so far as to say that the joy of studying is not discovering that you are right, but discovering that you are wrong and being willing to change. So our sixth characteristic of study in the Dominican tradition is that it is transformative. At the outset, I said that there are 7 that I wanted to talk about. With your permission, I'm going to reserve the 7th till the end, and I want to shift now to speaking about facing the future. When I look to the future and reflect on how the charism of study in Dominican tradition might be most needed for the church and the world in our day and in the days to come, 2 particularly urgent needs come immediately to mind. There are many more, but mindful of the limited time we have, I will highlight only 2. The first is the great need for peace-building, healing, and reconciliation in a world and church torn apart by war, violence, and divisions. In the church, there is great polarization over the meaning of Vatican II and what are the ways to be faithful to the spirit of renewal that began 50 years ago. And in our country, there are deep divisions that become even more pronounced in this election season. Often our public discourse lacks even civility and respect, as mudslinging, name-calling, and distortions of facts rule the day. In the global world, divisions between rich and poor widen to a shocking degree. Wars rage and old hatreds flare, fueled by fear and misunderstanding of those whose religion, race, or culture is different. And earth cries out as its resources are plundered, while humans argue about how to ensure sustainability. I would like to propose that Dominicans, with our tradition of study, our search for truth, and our tradition of disputatio, have a gift to offer. The Dominican tradition of disputatio is one in which we enter into respectful dialogue with others who hold a differing position from our own, in order to arrive together at truth. When Thomas Aquinas practiced this, he began with the assumption that his opponent is always, in some sense, right. Timothy Radcliffe observes, quote, "It is easy to identify another person's errors. Do we have the courage to hear what they may teach us?" End quote. To enter into disputatio requires assiduous study of the issues and critical analysis of the social and cultural contexts. The aim is not to prove that my position is the true one. That stance only leads to greater division. The aim, rather, is to come to greater unity through deeper understanding of the multifaceted diamond that is truth, and to come to a greater respect and understanding of one another, which brings possibilities for healing and reconciliation. The intent is not to erase all distinctions and come to uniformity, but rather to respect differences and to engage them honestly and lovingly, recognizing that truth abides in many unexpected places. In Dominican tradition, truth is not a thing to be possessed. I can never speak of my truth or have the certainty that I know the truth absolutely. For Dominicans, truth is something to be sought humbly, with an openness to finding it in unexpected places, as we learn from other cultures, traditions, and religions. Thomas Aquinas said that we are mendicants for the truth, happy to beg a little bit of illumination from everyone whom we meet on the road. And so this requires a willingness to cross over, to see with the eyes of the other, letting go of some of my own certitude. One example of how Jesus did this is in his lengthy dialogue with the Samaritan woman at the well, as recounted in the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 4 to 42. Jesus not only crossed over into her geographical territory, but also into her theological world, as he used her language and categories to talk about the expected Messiah. He used words like teacher and prophet like Moses, rather than the way his people were accustomed to speak about a royal Davidic Messiah. Such respectful engagement across boundaries of difference brings us closer to the truth that sets us free with its healing and reconciling power. The second urgent need that I see, to which Dominican intellectual tradition can make an important contribution, is the work for greater equality for women in the global world and for fuller use of women's gifts and wisdom at all levels in the church. It is still the case that the majority of the world's poor are women and children, and that 2/3 of the world's illiterate are women. The UN Commission on the Status of Women reports that women do 2/3 of the world's work, when you include all the uncompensated labor that women do in homemaking and in caring for children. And for this, they earn 1/10 of the world's income and own only 1/100th of the world's property. As it assessed the state of the world's population at the turn of the millennium in the year 2000, the United Nations found that discrimination and violence against women are still firmly rooted in most cultures. 2 of its 8 Millennium Development Goals are aimed at promoting gender equality and empowering women, one through eliminating disparities in primary and secondary education, and the other through improving maternal health care. Dominican intellectual tradition impels us to be studying the causes for these inequities and to be working for transformative change on behalf of women. Likewise, our study of the scriptures, history, and tradition impel us to ask new questions and envision new answers to questions about women's roles in the church. Women were the first followers of Dominic, and all 4 Gospels depict women followers of Jesus as the first to whom he entrusted the news of the resurrection. And yet women continue to be restricted and excluded from many ministries and from higher levels of decision-making in a church that remains steadfastly patriarchal. Although in the 13th century, Dominic envisioned the role of women Dominicans as cloistered and praying for the friars while they went about their itinerant studying and preaching, it was not long before women Dominicans were claiming their charism for preaching, devoting themselves to study, and doing so outside the cloister walls. One prime example is our Sister Catherine of Siena, whose study and prayer led her to travel from Siena to Avignon to preach truth to the Pope himself. And her scholarship survives in her Dialogue of Divine Providence, and over 300 of her letters are extant. It is now the case that many vowed Dominican women and lay women formed in the Dominican intellectual tradition hold doctorates in scripture, theology, and all other disciplines. These women have been in the forefront of developing new approaches to the study of scriptures and tradition, enabling us to retrieve women's experience and history so as to reinterpret our sacred texts and tradition in ways that could reshape the church into a community of equal disciples. Last January, Father Bruno Cadore, current Master General of the Order, wrote a letter to the Dominican family entitled Dominican Women and Evangelization. He observes, quote, that there is still so much to do, that everywhere the words of women and men may have equal value, rejecting all injustices and violence that still affects so many women throughout the world. He continues, Dominican women have the task of reminding all, even in the midst of many odds, that the world may not be at peace as long as these inequities are not resolved. End quote. In our brother Bruno's letter, he reflects on Jesus' words to Mary Magdalene when Jesus appeared to her at the empty tomb, saying, "Go tell my brothers," John 20, verse 17. Father Bruno remarks on the particular gifts that women bring to the holy preaching and to the mission of evangelization. Quote, "The mission of evangelization needs this witness and this announcement to help the world hear this word that carries life within it." End quote. So my hope for the future is that our study of the scriptures and tradition will open the way for women to take their rightful place as equal disciples at the table and preachers of the word in every venue, including at Eucharist. Finally, in thinking about the future, I believe that the Dominican intellectual tradition will be carried on not only, and perhaps not primarily, by vowed Dominican women and men, but by lay Dominican associates and lay professors and students in Dominican schools, colleges, and universities. This gift of Dominican intellectual tradition does not only belong to vowed Dominicans, but to this extended family of Dominic, whose progeny are in every land and every place. To conclude, I have tried to show how important study is to the Dominican way of life, from the founding of the order until now. I have identified 6 characteristics of Dominican study, saying that it is a charism, a free gift from God, which flows into contemplation, that it is for the sake of the mission, it is communal in nature, and it is a lively engagement with the present with a view to the future, and it is transformative. I have proposed that the Dominican intellectual tradition can be a gift to help heal the violence and divisions in our world and church, and that it can move us to dismantle structures that prevent equality for women in church and society. There is one last characteristic of study in the Dominican tradition that I want to speak about, and you can probably identify more. But the last one that I want to comment on is that study is a labor of love. Now, at the beginning, I said that study is a gift from God, given freely, but I want to balance that out by saying that it also must be cultivated through dedication and discipline every day. Dominicans sometimes speak of being crucified on the wood of their desk. This is not to say that study is an onerous burden for us, but it means that we recognize that study is arduous. It requires the giving of one's whole self in response to the one who has set us ablaze with passion for the truth and with love for God and for all God's people. Study is a labor of love, but it is a costly love. As it was for Jesus, our pursuit of truth is freeing and joyous, but this does not occur without passing through the crucible of suffering and death. Like Jesus, we are set aflame for life. We are consumed by the fire of divine love, set aflame for the transformative work of birthing the reign of God. All of us here present have been so formed in the Dominican intellectual tradition. How will you pass on this legacy? I think we have about 15 minutes for questions, comments, observations, and Mark will bring the microphone to you so that the recording will pick it up.
Barbara, thank you very much. It was an inspiring talk. And I was very glad when you got to the seventh one. I kept thinking to myself, even as you were speaking of Yves Congar and his, the fruit of his work in terms of Vatican II, we're also very aware of the suffering that he experienced at the hand of his own church and his own brothers, because, as you said, we are seeking the truth. We were on the edge. We are looking for something new. And whenever that is proposed, there is always resistance. And so discipline is a strong part of study, as is the sacrifice, the making holy of bringing forth that truth. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kay. Mm-hmm.
I'm in the math department, and we've been studying in our math courses the times when we run out of words, and we fall back on sophisticated notation, and it stands for a lot of things. But it's been happening a lot now that we're paying attention to it. I was wondering if you want to say anything more about Thomas runs out of words because he's contemplating. Is it too sophisticated or too much? I was just wondering what your take on something like that was. How many times when you get in deep, you run out of words, and that's what I like about Aquinas, is it's a place where we want that to happen once in a while.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, that when our study takes us deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, especially if we're studying scripture and theology, it's taking us deeper and deeper into the heart of mystery. And like Thomas, the words seem, it's not possible to capture that in words. And if we think we have, then we're even further away from knowing the goal of our study and our contemplation. And so it's that point of wordlessness that I think we know we're coming ever closer to the heart of that mystery that cannot be captured in words or formulas. I think you're exactly right. And I think Thomas had a profound experience of that at the end of his life. And it's one that I think is, well, that is the fruits of his lifelong study. I was going to say it's what we all aspire for, but you don't aspire for the fruits of it. You aspire to not only understand, but to live and be the truth of the Holy One that we are seeking. And the fruits of when you come very close to touching that mystery cannot be expressed in words. And I think not only as you've discovered in math, it doesn't happen only in studying theology and scripture. Any discipline can take us there. I think that's one of the brilliant inspirations of some of the early Dominicans, that any discipline takes you into the heart of God. All the paths lead into the center of the Holy One.
Barbara, I was really interested in your comment about that the role of Dominicans is to bridge build and disputatio and that. And I know at Aquinas we're challenged with trying to think of a way of talking about difficult subjects among the community, because there's a lot of disagreement and that, especially in terms of what does the Catholic Church teach about certain things and what do people believe about certain things. And I'm just wondering, there's a lot of fear when one moves into dialogue, because the fear is that the truth will get muddled, and that my truth, or the way I perceive truth, will get muddled. And so when we sit down with someone else and we listen, maybe you know, things will get lost. And I guess I'd be curious as to your advice as to how one engages in those conversations and not have fear.
That's a very challenging question. I think you're exactly right that fear and cynicism and judgmentalness can be some of the biggest roadblocks to our being able to engage in authentic dialogue. My own Dominican sisters are smiling because they recognize those as the three things that our facilitator was working with us on in our chapter in January and February. That as we were trying to move to a place of being able to listen to one another better and to be able to share the deepest longings of our heart with one another, our facilitator very wisely helped us to identify when fear was getting in the way, when cynicism was getting in the way, saying, we tried that, it doesn't work, you know, or when our judgmentalness would get in the way of, oh, well, I've known that person for 20 years and I know she's going to say this, you know, and so those kinds of, the judgmentalness, the fear, the cynicism are huge obstacles to being able to enter into authentic dialogue, especially dialogue across boundaries of difference. And I would add, when it comes to interreligious dialogue, or when it comes to dialogue across differences, even within our own Catholic tradition, that a huge obstacle is if I am absolutely certain that I have the truth or that I know the truth and that it can't be any other way. And if the aim is to try to convince the other person of my position, then the dialogue is doomed. So one of the things that we've found in our interreligious dialogue that we have had at Catholic Theological Union, where I teach, is that all the participants in the dialogue agreed to some basic ground rules for interreligious dialogue. And those ground rules include things like coming with an open heart and an open mind, the willingness to discover what the other understands and how the other thinks. And so that requires a certain security in my own self and a certain selflessness to be able to try to look through the other's lenses, to try to walk in the shoes of the other, to see if I can understand, and to ask questions not to debate what they are saying, but genuine curiosity about, explain to me more about what you mean by that. What do you understand by that? And that in the exchange, in that kind of exchange and respectful dialogue, where we're not debating one another, but we're trying to understand and listen to the other, it puts you in a different stance and can bring about fruits of dialogue much differently. So in my experience, too, in ecumenical dialogue, the other thing that makes a real difference is if there is personal relationship built up with the other. So that in the 6 years that I was in ecumenical dialogue with United Methodists, the whole first weekend that we spent with one another, we spent the whole time just getting to know one another, just listening to each other's stories about where they grew up and what shaped them and what interests them now. And we didn't talk about the topic at hand at all until the next time that we came together. And as we learned about one another's families and who and what they cared most deeply about, we formed personal bonds first. And as soon as you start to care about the other person, then it gets real hard to demonize them or to fit them into boxes that, you know, are based on preconceived notions. So those are a few of the ways that can foster dialogue across differences, but it's very hard work. And people should not come into those kinds of dialogues lightly. Or, you know, it's like what Kay was saying, that study is very hard work. So is interreligious dialogue. So is dialogue across differences in our own tradition. In fact, it's even harder because we're family, you know. And so it takes very hard work, and people should be prepared to work hard at it and not expect it to just happen instantly. and be prepared to let themselves be challenged, let themselves be changed in the process. And as Kay remarked, we don't like to be changed. We like things the way they are, and so we usually don't want to have the boat rocked. So being willing to have my boat be rocked and not come in with the stance that I'm going to rock their boat, make them change.
Thank you very much. I was touched by what you said about, particularly about ground rules and relationships. And a thought occurred to me to ask you a question. What would you think of the value or lack of value of weaving some of Carl Rogers' concepts on paraphrasing content and paraphrasing emotions into the ground rules?
Sure, I think that works too. There are a lot of people who have worked at what are some of the strategies that work in dialogue, and being able to listen well enough to repeat back to a person what you heard them say, and then to ask for them to explain further is a very powerful way of communicating to another that you're trying to understand, and also of opening yourself to being changed. Thank you.
Hi, a quick question. I know that we, as a school, have been trying to identify what it means to be a Catholic college, and something I've been kind of grappling with is it really just a philosophy in terms of how you approach education, or is it the people? I know here we're about 50-50 in terms of Catholic students and non-students, which is great, and I love it. But I was having a discussion with a friend, and I was like, what if we got to a point where it was 80% non-Catholic students? Does that make our identity as a Catholic college irrelevant or not as important? So I was just curious what you have to say.
I don't think it's about numbers and percentages. I think it's the whole history of this college and the ethos and the legacy on which it is built, on which it is still operating, and which it will into the future. And it won't depend on the majority of students being Catholic. It will depend on whether the whole heart and mind and understanding of the college, what it's about, and what it is trying to do. It won't depend on the numbers per se. It's not, so if the student body becomes 60% other than Catholic, does not mean it's not going to be a Catholic college anymore. It will mean that as the professors and students who are Catholic keep that tradition alive of being formed in the Catholic and specifically Dominican intellectual tradition, it is that way of being and what the college is about that makes it Catholic. So, for example, if the day comes, please God, this will never happen, but if the day comes that there are no Dominican sisters left on the faculty, does that mean this is no longer a Dominican college? I don't think so, because everyone who's been teaching here has been formed in the Dominican intellectual tradition and has bought into that and is passing it on. And so it will continue to be Dominican, whether the Dominican sisters are still teaching here. Does that make any sense?